So the word Euphrates appears in Revelation twice, and in fact, for the New Testament, it appears twice, and both of those are in Revelation. And you see it quite a few times in the Old Testament, but really only those two times in the New Testament. And so we're going to be looking at the first one in Revelation, which is also chronologically the first one in the time order of events that Revelation talks about. And it's the breaking out reference to Euphrates. And that will mean more to you as we go into this and you'll understand what that means. So that's what we're doing with this video today. So as I said, it's the first of two separate references to the Euphrates River in Revelation. And this one happens during, or this event, I'll call it, happens during the period of the sixth trumpet. And the sixth trumpet is right near the end. When the seventh trumpet sounds, that's the end right there. That's when Jesus returns. And the trumpet periods are all 3.5 years long. So the sixth trumpet period is the last 3.5 years before Jesus returns. So we're right near the end of everything with this reference to the Euphrates. And so what you need to know about the Euphrates is that it's a very long river. It's a 1,740 mile long river. But you're going to see the Bible refer to a point on it, or not so much a point, but it will treat it like it is a point on the map. And there's a particular location on that. And so it's going to talk about these four angels who come from this kind of point on the river, but we don't know where that point is. But we do know that this is going to be not the location of the real event. This is the starting point of the story, and it's likely the location of the cause that leads up to this whole event. And we talked about this before, about something like 8 months ago, in a really more detailed video. And if you're watching the YouTube video right now, you should see a little box pop up at the screen that will tell you how to get to that video. And we dealt with it in much more depth back then. And this time we're just going to hit the high points through this. And so somewhere at some point along the Euphrates is the beginning point for this. It appears to be a cause for all of the things that come after. And Strong's Concordance uses or defines the word Euphrates as from an unused root meaning to break forth or rushing. And this outbreak idea is really what's behind this particular event that happens in the sixth trumpet. And so there's an outbreak of things that happen. And as we dig into this, you'll probably remember this if you've seen that video before. And so it probably happens, the whole event takes about a year. So it probably happens pretty near the start of that 3.5 years, but not right at the very beginning, I suspect. So maybe a year into that 3.5 year period. And as I said, this is all described in detail in that lesson called The Sixth Trumpet. You can look that up, or you can follow the link that I should remember to put on here. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of all of the events that happen, or all of the things that happen in this event, we'll say. And then we'll dig into the verses that talk about it in a little more detail, but not as much detail as that other video. And so it all begins with that something that happens that is associated with this point on the Euphrates River. And we don't know what that something is. In the other video, we kind of take some guesses as to the kind of things that have started big disastrous wars before. And so maybe it's kind of like that, maybe it's not. But something happens along the Euphrates River, and the Bible describes that as four angels being released over time periods. And we understand that, if you remember from the last video, or we'll deal with some of those details in this video, the consequence of this thing that happens on the Euphrates River is a nuclear war, an exchange of nuclear weapons in the geographic area of China and India. And we know that those are both nuclear powers at this time. So that's not really a big surprise to us. And we have, the Bible doesn't say China and India, but it really, in describing the scale of the deaths, it is pretty clear that it has to happen in those highly populated areas of China and India. And they're a very small geographic area on the earth, on the face of the earth. So what Revelation does describe is death breaking out in four overlapping time periods. And each one of these, it talks about being four angels, and each one of these angels has a period in which he operates in. And one operates for an hour, one operates for a day, one for a month, one for a year. But they all head out from the Euphrates and begin their work immediately. So these appear to be overlapping time periods, although that doesn't matter an awful lot. So it begins with this event on the Euphrates River. And that's going to be the first nuclear strike, and probably almost certainly soon after, the counterstrike comes back from the other group who are firing nuclear weapons. Now, the idea of China and India may be very different at that time. We're talking about a world that is quite different in a lot of ways, but we would refer to those countries as China and India right now. So the first angel's period is 1 hour, and that is probably the period in which the immediate deaths from the nuclear weapons detonations happen. And so people die immediately because of the explosions, or some of them are so badly injured by the explosions that they die within an hour. And then the angel for a day is probably referring to the deaths of what you often call walking dead in these situations. People who are so badly wounded that they aren't going to be able to recover, and they're not going to die right away, but it's going to take them a little while to die. And this was true in the Nagasaki and Hiroshima detonations of nuclear weapons as well. Some people were so poisoned with radiation that they hadn't died, they were still walking around, but they were effectively dead. There was no way they'd be recovering. And so the third angel has a period of operation of a month, and the deaths associated with him are almost certainly from infrastructure collapse. The nuclear weapons would blow up all of the water distribution, all the food distribution, the roads, things like that. And so all of that infrastructure stuff collapses, and because of that, people can't get things that are essential to life, like water and food. And they can't even get out of the area if they want to get to a better area. Often major roads would be destroyed by that. And so a whole bunch more people die over this 1 month period for those kind of reasons. And the fourth angel has a time period of a year. And this is probably the deaths that come from a societal collapse. Things like disease spreading, murders. What often happens is you see people form together to protect themselves and to work cooperatively, but these groups are ruthless and murderous sometimes. And so if you aren't part of their group, they may kill you just to be safe. And if you remember the Mad Max series of movies, that goes back quite a ways. It's a post-apocalyptic period like that where people are struggling to survive, and anyone who seems like a threat or an opportunity to get something from them, steal something or whatever, is taken advantage of. So it's a very ruthless world where life has very little meaning. And so that would last for that 1 year period of the fourth angel. And so this kind of gives us the big overview of what happens. A whole lot of deaths come in stages as part of a nuclear strike and restrike that is returned. And the final result of all of these things is that 1/3 of Earth's population is dead. And so this is, God is kind of showing this last in the sequence of things, or near the very end, as sort of the crowning achievement of the rule of mankind. You've been in charge of yourselves, man. You've done such a wonderful job. You've managed to kill 1/3 of the Earth's population, something that was never popular in any period of history until now. And now that you have this ability, you've done this thing. And so the rule of mankind is kind of what's in doubt and coming to an end here. When Jesus comes, the rule of mankind ends, and there'll be no more of this war and nuking people. So we'll go to the actual verses now that talk about these things, and you can see for yourself what I've been describing. So from Revelation 9:13-15, it says, after these things, the sixth angel sounded, and I talked about the sixth angel, and I heard one voice from the horns of the altar of gold, which is before God, which said to the sixth angel that had a trumpet, loose the four angels imprisoned at the great river Euphrates. There's that one Euphrates reference there. And those four angels were released who were prepared for an hour and for a day and for a month and for a year to kill 1/3 of the children of men. So that really lays out a good part of what I had described to you earlier. And so this is kind of a summary. We're going to see more details that are going to come after this. And so this summary is kind of the last major event before Jesus returns. And we would obviously see that as major, with the destruction of 1/3 of the population of the planet. But other things do happen in the sixth angel period, but we're not going to go into those here. But there are some other things that go along with this. And I actually meant to take out that last line, so we'll ignore that and move on. So what is the thing that caused the death? I've already said that it's a nuclear weapon, but the Bible does give a description for it in a symbolic way. And so after saying that 1/3 of the population will die, as we just saw, the Bible does describe the instrument of that death and gives us some hints about the people who are firing off these nuclear weapons as well. So it gives the cause of the deaths here in Revelation 9:16. It says, And the number of the army of the horsemen was 10,000 10,000s, which is 200 million. And I heard their number, says John. So these horsemen, this part especially, we took into more detail in the other video. And if you want to go for that, you can look at that video. So these horsemen are described as men who ride horses, and they are in a charging attack. In history, charging attacks were often done by horsemen with spears or even just swords, and they would charge at the enemy like that. And so the imagery here is of something that comes in a charging attack. And it says that this is an army, and so this we understand is a military attack. And the 200 million is the strength of the army of the horsemen. It's not the count of the horsemen themselves. And so it probably means 200 megatons, and that would make a certain amount of sense. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were comparatively small things to that. They were 0.015 and 0.025 megatons. So while they were massively destructive to those cities, in order to destroy 1/3 of the Earth's population, you need a whole lot more megatons spread over a much bigger area. And so 200 megatons would probably be about the right number you would need to destroy the infrastructure and completely collapse these countries, as we see happens and results in the huge number of deaths, especially large number of deaths. For Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the deaths were great for sure, but there were a lot of people who did survive that. And the reason was there were people from nearby cities who could come and help them. But when you do an all-out attack and essentially wipe out the bulk of the people, there aren't enough people left to help those who were injured. And you have an increase in deaths because of the scale that you've gone to. Some gruesome background there. Okay, so it describes horses in Revelation. And this is from Revelation 9:17. And in this way, I saw the horses in a vision. Now he's seeing this in a vision, so in a symbolic way, he sees these things. And those sitting upon them had breastplates of fire and chalcedony brimstone, and the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and fire and brimstone and smoke proceeded from their mouths. So that those words in a vision are telling us this is not a physical description. In fact, I only know of one place where Revelation gives a physical description of something that's in the future. In all the other cases, they are symbolic descriptions of the characteristics of things. So what these heads of horses and heads of lions and all that sort of stuff, these are all symbolic descriptions of characteristics of what's going to be happening and what these weapons are. And so as horses, they represent speed. Back at that time, the horse was the fastest way you could get anywhere. And so horses were thought of as the way that you would travel great distances in a short time. And so that's why horses are used there. They obviously couldn't use any of the words that we use now because they wouldn't have meant anything to the people of that time. But you do see brimstone, which is the word we would use for sulfur. All right, sulfur is the word we would use for brimstone, I should say. But metaphorically, the brimstone refers to burning rock that destroys. And if you've ever played with sulfur, it is a yellowish rock-like thing that you can start on fire. And once you start it on fire, it doesn't go out easily at all. And if it touches anything else, it starts that thing on fire. So brimstone has this meaning to it as burning rock that destroys anything that it gets in contact with. And the Bible has a number of references to brimstone. And so just for reference, it talks about brimstone with Sodom and Gomorrah, and you know that story and what happens there. It talks about brimstone with the lake of fire, which is the ultimate destination of the evil people of the earth. And it's also used in other places to indicate general destruction of things. So brimstone has that meaning here. And we know that a nuclear warhead brings all of these things, the fire, the brimstone, and the smoke. The fire would be the bright light of the explosion. The brimstone would be the burning uranium. Uranium and plutonium don't burn in the sense of a fire. It's not a chemical reaction. It's a nuclear reaction. But nonetheless, you could call that burning. And you wouldn't have a better word in Hebrew or Aramaic or anything, or Greek. And so burning is the word that's used there. And we also know radioactive clouds of debris are the result that you get from firing a nuclear warhead at a city or any place above land. And so that would be the smoke that's referred to here. So those things line up with the idea of a nuclear warhead. And we'll see other references here that make it pretty clear that that's what we're talking about. So It also refers to a breastplate, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail. We did that in the other video. But the breastplate is a signature that you, at that time, would be able to recognize as being kind of the emblem or the symbol or a symbolic description of the people who have these horses, these missiles, we're going to call them, and are firing them. And so there's kind of a symbol that refers to them. But that symbol doesn't make any sense to us in this time. We don't know those groups. They may not even exist yet. So Revelation continues on, and it talks about not just the horses, but their mouths and their tails. And it says, and by these three scourges, a third of the children of men were killed, by the fire, by the brimstone, and by the smoke that proceeded from their mouths, from the mouths of the horses, because the power of the horses was in their mouths and also in their tails. And we recognize what that would mean in our time pretty easily. And so it says a third of the children of men, and there's no way to take that symbolically. I've wondered many times and looked at it many times, is this just kind of a symbolic reference to something? But when it says children of men, that's not a symbol that's ever used in Revelation anywhere to refer to anything other than literal people. And when it says a third, well, you just can't get away from a third. It's pretty obvious. There's no other way to take that. And when it says that they are killed, that's also a phrase that is used. Sometimes it talks about death in a symbolic way, but when it says killed, it always means in Revelation that it is talking about a literal death. And so physical death seems to be what's meant here. And so in our time, given the current population of the Earth, which is about 2.7 billion people, or no, it's about 8 billion people. And so 2.7 billion would be the number of people who would be killed if that event happened in our time right now. And so that's an astronomical number of people. It's just an unfathomable number of people being killed. And what it says here is the power of the horses is in their mouths, and it describes the fire, the brimstone, and the smoke. And those are all symbolic descriptions we talked about just before, about them referring to the characteristics of a nuclear weapon exploding, detonating. And it talks about the other source of the power being the tails. And we understand that from our technology. We understand how nuclear weapons get there. They get there by missiles of various kinds. And so the tails are symbolic of the engines, and that is what gives them their power to travel great distances at great speed and arrive and invoke the destruction that they do invoke. Okay, I'm going to repeat one of the verses from that. And it says, and by these three scourges, we're going to focus on this scourges idea, a third of the children of men were killed by the fire, by the brimstone, and by the smoke that proceeded from their mouths. Okay, a scourge is a word that we don't use very often anymore. We would use the word whip. It's the same thing. And so that brings to mind who is doing the whipping here. It's saying that this nuclear attack is a scourge. And what we'll see here is that this is God causing, or at least allowing this to happen for a purpose. And so it's a little bit similar to Egypt when the Israelites were leaving. He, in some sense of the word, caused those 10 plagues to fall on them and destroy Egyptian society. And in the same way here, the same thing is happening where these weapons are going to be fired by men, and God is, in a sense, causing it, or at least allowing it. And he's doing that for a purpose. It's not just to rain down destruction on people. And it's going to talk about that a little bit more here and later. And so it is a whip that he's using, and a whip in the sense of trying to get these people to do the right thing and trying to get some sense into these people. And so his goal here is, with all this huge numbers of deaths, is that he wants them to see a message in this. He wants them to see the failure of what they're doing. And so these deaths are to be a scourge, not to the people who are killed, but to the people who are still living afterward. And so these deaths are a whip on the living. It's sort of, look at what you've done. Look at this horrible thing. Look at your evil ways. And that's what God wants the whole world that survives this to see, is the evil of their ways, and to turn away from those and to turn to God's ways. And we'll see how that turns out. Not so good. Revelation 9:20-21 says, and the rest of the children of men who were not killed by the scourges did not turn from the work of their hands, to not worship devils and idols of gold, of silver, and of brass, and of wood, and of stone, which do not see, neither hear, nor are able to walk. That's very similar to something Isaiah says. He talks about these silly things that you make with your own hands. Can't hear, they can't walk, they can't see. Why would you bother with them? And so a similar reference here. And it says, and they did not turn from their murders or from their witchcraft or from their fornication. And so the result of this is that there's no change among the living. They are determined to keep on doing things the way they want to do them and to not turn to God. And they probably don't even see this as a message from God. And you can easily think of that in our time. How would we interpret a mass nuclear exchange killing a third of the population? We would blame it on the people who fired the missiles. We're unlikely to see it as a message from God. But very often, God does things like this. He brings things into our lives that we're supposed to be looking at and saying, oh, maybe this is a message from God, and maybe He's wanting me to change something in my life, and whatever that might be in your life that you would have to identify. So you have to wonder, could they even see this as a consequence of rejecting God? And we know from Israel and God's efforts to bring them back to Him before the Babylonian destruction that landed on them, they didn't see it that way. Even though they had prophets warning them of all these things that God was going to bring on them, they just weren't able to accept that idea. And so, how would people who don't have prophets telling them that these things are coming and warning them to have any hope of understanding that this is a consequence of their turning from God, and it's something that God has allowed to come on them as a message to them to turn away from their evil ways? And so people are without ungodly people just don't have the nature, I think, to even look at a sign like that and to see it for what it is. And we saw a little bit of that when the Twin Towers were knocked down. What we saw in the churches for about the next 2 or maybe even 4 weeks is that people headed to the churches, and everybody was headed off to the church to get baptized and turn back to God. But within about a month after that, the churches were back to about their normal populations, and everybody had gone back to their thing. So for a moment in time there, people saw the Twin Towers as a call from God to get their act together. But very quickly they turned away from that and back to their original ways. Okay, so that's the first one. Any questions on that one?
And I was just wondering if some of the destruction might be included because of the plagues, like the viruses that have been unleashed as well.
Um, what is being described there is not a chemical weapon or a biological weapon. It's definitely a nuclear weapon. And that relates to its description as being fire and smoke and those characteristics. So now there would certainly be disease. I talked a bit about that in that message, is that one of the results of this kind of mass death is that you can't bury the bodies, and the bodies become disease ridden, and the rats spread all of that around, and so you would have certain kinds of plagues that would result, and that just naturally result from not being able to keep things sanitary. And so yeah, some of those deaths would be as a result of plagues, but the plague isn't really part of what happens, not directly.
I think there's a lot of people that think the same way as people thought when the Twin Towers fell, that they'll get a warning like that they'll get a chance to repent, that they'll get a way out of some way. But I don't think that's going to happen at all.
Well, not for one
I
third of the Earth's
don't. I don't think you
population.
can fool God with that.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people do have that kind of thinking that they're going to, at the last minute, they're going to convert and become a Christian. Well, that doesn't always work that way.